A man living alone in a research station on an alien planet saves an injured female alien. When he accidentally bathes her to heal her wounds, she mistakes it as her species' permanent mating ritual. Now she refuses to leave and is determined to repay him in a strange way. The last thing I expected when I signed up for the Zerathian Outpost project was to end up kneeling half-naked in a steaming hydro chamber, holding the limp body of a glowing alien girl who had just crashed through my perimeter fence like a meteor dipped in starlight and desperation. But that's the thing about isolation missions. You start expecting the impossible because it's the only thing that ever actually shows up. And this time, it showed up bleeding, shivering, and wrapped in what looked like torn animal hide and cosmic frost. Her pale white hair was tangled around delicate ears that curled slightly at the tips like a fox's, and her light blue skin pulsed with soft bioluminescent ripples that didn't match any species in my database. She looked half dead and wholly unreal. I had seen hallucinations before, especially after 10 weeks without direct human contact, but this wasn't one of them. She was solid, warm, and quietly leaking some kind of silver fluid onto my floor. I should have called it in. Except the long-range comms were still down from the last ion storm, and frankly, I didn't want to explain to Mission Control why there was an unconscious, humanoid female alien collapsed on my doorstep wearing what amounted to tribal fur and ceremonial jewelry. So I did the only thing I could. I scanned her. Her vitals were unstable, erratic. Her blood chemistry was completely foreign, but something about the data patterns reminded me of resonance-based life forms. Every time I touched her skin, her vitals briefly spiked like my presence was stabilizing her, like my body heat or scent or even just proximity triggered something. I didn't have time to overthink it. She was crashing fast, and my medbot refused to treat unknown xenotypes without confirmed clearance. So I carried her into the emergency deck suite, initiated a biorinse, and prayed it wouldn't kill her. The hydrojets hissed to life. Warm mist filled the chamber. She remained unconscious in my arms, breathing shallow and uneven, while the cleansing solution coated her skin in slow, glowing rivulets. Her clothing, if you could call it that, clung to her in soaked layers of fur and crystal thread that started to dissolve on contact with the sterilizing mist. I averted my eyes out of instinct and guilt, but when I reached up to adjust the temperature, my fingers brushed her lower back. Her body jolted in my arms. Not violently, not like a seizure. More like a sudden awakening, as if some ancient mechanism inside her had just clicked into place. Her eyes opened. Bright violet. Large. Unblinking. They locked onto mine with such intensity that my entire chest seized for a second. She didn't scream or panic. She just stared, pupils dilated, an expression unreadable. Then, in a voice like water over glass, she whispered, "You bathed me. Now I belong to you." I froze. Literally froze, hand still on the control panel, wondering if I had misheard. But she didn't stop. Her body trembled slightly, not from weakness, but something deeper. Ritualistic. Her hand rose slowly and rested against my chest, fingers tipped with soft claws pressing lightly through my soaked shirt. She tilted her head, almost feline in curiosity. "Your scent is inside me now," she said softly. "It is sealed." I wanted to speak. To say what? That I didn't mean to? That this was a medical necessity, not a proposal? But her expression made it clear she had already decided. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was some sort of cultural threshold. I had crossed it. I just didn't know how. And yet, something in her tone wasn't accusing. It was reverent. Grateful. Almost worshipful. The scanner beeped again, this time showing stable vitals. Her pulse had synced with mine. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew it wasn't nothing. Her hand stayed over my heart, and when I finally found the nerve to whisper, "What are you?" she just smiled faintly, eyes softening, and said, "I am yours. You touched my body with water. That is the ancient right. I cannot return to my people now. I am bonded." The mist was star. She followed me out of the hydro chamber like a shadow of light and heat, bare feet silent against the metal floor, her damp hair dripping slowly down her back as the air recycling vents hissed in quiet rhythm, but I could feel her eyes on me with every step, not blinking, not wandering, just fixed, intense, like she was memorizing every movement I made, and the strange part was that I didn't feel threatened by it, not exactly, it was more like being watched by something sacred and wild, a creature that had chosen me for reasons I couldn't understand and now moved through my world with total certainty that she belonged here, and I had no idea what to do with that, so I did what I always did when I was overwhelmed. I reached for routine, pulling a dry towel from the storage locker and trying to hand it to her without making eye contact, except she didn't take it, not right away, instead she just tilted her head, ears twitching slightly, and stepped closer, so close I could feel the warmth radiating off her bare skin and the slow, deliberate rise and fall of her chest, and when I finally looked up she was already lifting her arms, accepting the towel not as a tool but as an offering, like she was allowing me to give her something intimate, something ceremonial, and as I gently began to wrap it around her shoulders, her hands came up and touched mine again, not forcefully but with a strange reverence that made the air between us hum, and then her voice, quiet, and low, and strangely melodic, said, "You are careful, but not afraid. That means you are worthy," and I didn't know whether to laugh or run because nothing in my life had prepared me for this moment, for an alien girl who had just declared herself mine based on an emergency sanitation procedure, and yet the way she said it, like it was law older than any civilization I knew, made me hesitate, made me wonder if maybe I was the one who didn't understand the rules anymore. She followed me into the main living chamber without being told, without asking, her eyes darting briefly to the ceiling lights and the flickering holodisplay showing local wind currents outside, but her attention always returned to me like I was her anchor in this strange new space, and I could feel the tension in the room rising by the second, not angry, or chaotic but charged, like the static before a storm, like something about her presence was rearranging the air molecules themselves, and when I reached for a blanket and pointed her toward the thermal bench, she sat obediently, gracefully, folding her legs beneath her in a way that made the towel shift just enough to show the smooth curve of her thigh, and I tried not to notice, tried to focus on the translation scanner running in the corner or the faint beeping of the biosensors still tracking her vitals, but she noticed my hesitation, she saw it in my eyes, and instead of backing away, she leaned forward slightly, her voice curious and steady as she asked, "Do human males not accept bonding?" And I blinked, stunned by the directness of the question and the way her words carried no shame, no shyness, just pure inquiry, as if the concept of embarrassment didn't exist for her species, or maybe just not for her, and I tried to explain, fumbling through the cultural difference, through the idea that in my world, intimacy and trust took time, that we didn't just pair for life based on a single act, and she listened, eyes wide and serious, nodding slowly, but when I finished, she only said, "Time is not how we measure trust. Only action," and she stood again, walking toward me, the towel slipping slightly but still clutched in one hand, her body marked by faint glowing lines like bioluminescent tattoos that pulsed softly as she moved, and I backed up without meaning to, until my back hit the wall and I had nowhere else to go. Her fingers reached for my shirt, touching the damp fabric near my collarbone, and her eyes searched mine not for permission but for recognition, like she was asking if I understood what she was offering, what she believed had already. The next morning didn't feel like a morning at all, because the station's artificial cycle lights stayed dim and the usual chirping status tones from the atmospheric sensors were dead silent, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. But my mind was still fogged from the surreal night I had spent lying beside a glowing alien girl who clung to me like I was the last solid thing left in her universe, and when I finally opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was her staring back at me, still as stone, her violet irises flickering with faint inner light as she whispered softly, "You were warm all night." I did not expect it to last, and the way she said it, not surprised but relieved, made a chill run through me because it sounded like she had been waiting for me to disappear or fade like a dream, and I reached up without thinking, brushing her hair gently away from her face, and for a moment she closed her eyes and leaned into the touch with a sound that was not quite a sigh, more like a song exhaled from the core of her being, But the intimacy of that moment shattered the second the emergency alarm blared through the wall, shrill and angry and loud enough to make us both jolt upright as the voice of the station's internal AI barked a phrase I had never wanted to hear: unidentified aerial object approaching at suborbital speed, trajectory unstable, estimated impact within 2 minutes, and I didn't wait, didn't think, I was on my feet and dragging her with me before the echo had even died, adrenaline wiping away every trace of warmth and replacing it with cold, sharp calculation. She didn't ask questions, didn't resist. She followed me through the narrow corridors with silent urgency, her bare feet padding lightly behind me as I slammed the lockdown controls and activated the external cameras, my eyes widening as the display lit up with a blazing comet of fire streaking across the atmosphere, its core flickering in unnatural green patterns that looked less like meteorite plasma and more like manufactured propulsion, and I cursed under my breath because there was no reason for anything to be out here, no authorized flights, no scheduled drops, which meant either a rogue artifact falling from orbit or someone had found us, and I didn't like either option. And then she stopped walking, froze mid-step and grabbed my arm, her voice tight and low and edged with something I hadn't heard before. "It's them," and I stared at her, confusion rippling through me. "Who's them?" And her hand trembled against my skin as she said, "The ones who left me behind." And that was when the object broke apart in the sky, scattering fragments across the horizon like a mechanical starburst, and one of those pieces veered straight toward our coordinates, hitting the distant ridge with a boom that shook the entire station like it had been punched from orbit. I barely got her into the core shelter before the shockwave hit, a blast of compressed air and static energy that rattled the walls and sent sparks shooting from the conduit lines overhead, and we huddled together in the reinforced chamber, the emergency lighting casting deep amber shadows across her face as she stared at the door like it was going to melt, and I didn't know what to do because I had no weapons, no defense systems, just a small lab, a half-functional AI, and a woman who apparently had enemies capable of orbital re-entry. And when I asked her again, who were they, she didn't answer right away, just pressed her forehead to my chest and whispered, "They come for what they discard, not because they want it, but because they fear what it becomes." And that cryptic line sent a cold shiver crawling down my spine because suddenly I wasn't just sheltering a wounded girl anymore, I was harboring a fugitive, or a weapon, or something more, and the implications started stacking in my mind like collapsing dominoes, each one leading to a version of this story that ended very, very badly for me. The lights flickered and dimmed as the external sensor grid overloaded, and the kiss might have saved us or doomed us, I wasn't sure which, but either way it had happened, and now I was stuck inside a cramped rover shelter with a glowing alien girl curled against my side like she belonged there, which according to her species logic, she absolutely did. And as I tried to keep my mind focused on survival strategy instead of the fact that her fingers were lightly tracing the shape of my jaw like she was etching it into memory, the portable sensor beeped with a proximity alert that nearly made me jump out of my skin, and for a second I thought we had been found, that her former captors or creators or whatever they were had locked onto us. But when I glanced at the interface, it only showed a small reading, movement within a 20-meter range, likely local wildlife, harmless but curious, and I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my racing heart, except she hadn't flinched at all, hadn't even blinked, just looked up at me with that calm, terrifyingly sincere expression and said, "If they find us, I will bare my throat, and you must complete the bond," which immediately shattered whatever composure I had left because first of all, I didn't even know what baring her throat meant in her culture, and second, I was 99% sure completing the bond didn't involve any traditional paperwork or rings, and when I asked her, as gently and diplomatically as I could manage, "What exactly does that entail?" she paused, tilted her head, and replied, "I will explain," in gestures, which sounded both promising and deeply alarming. As it turned out, gestures meant her slowly lifting her hair away from her neck and tilting her head so the glowing blue line along her throat was fully exposed, and then placing my hand there, palm down, while maintaining completely unbroken eye contact, which would have been fine if she hadn't started softly humming like it was a spiritual ceremony and if the whole thing didn't make me feel like I had just stumbled into an interstellar wedding without pants. And I tried to keep my breathing steady, tried to focus on the situation, but my hand was on her throat, and her skin was warm and pulsing under my fingertips like it had its own rhythm separate from her heartbeat, and the look she gave me was so unflinchingly serious that I accidentally let out a nervous laugh, which apparently insulted the ritual, because she immediately frowned and said, "This is not for amusement," and I quickly apologized, trying to explain that human males sometimes laughed when we were anxious or overwhelmed or pressed against beautiful alien girls while hiding from potential assassins in a snow-covered death canyon. But she didn't entirely understand the concept, and her response was to move even closer until our knees were touching and say, "I can reduce your anxiety," which, bless her glowing heart, only made things infinitely worse. I pulled my hand back gently and tried to change the subject, pointing out that we still needed to figure out where those shadowy figures went, and whether the impact from the orbital fragment had buried their sensors or simply delayed them, and she listened, nodding, clearly trying to suppress the intensity of her instincts, though she still kept one hand on my thigh as if maintaining physical contact was mandatory for our survival, and every time I tried to shift slightly or scoot a bit to the side, she simply followed, effortlessly adjusting her position so that she remained exactly as close as before, which led to a hilariously awkward standoff where I ended up practically folded against the window while she watched me like I was malfunctioning and asked, "Is your body temperature too high? You appear flushed," and I muttered something about ventilation issues and tried to turn on the auxiliary fan, only for it to sputter and die with a sad wheeze because of course it did, because nothing in this place worked when I needed it most, and she took that as confirmation of my rising distress and immediately began unwrapping the thermal cloak she had draped around herself. The fire from our small heat lamp cast a soft glow across the cave walls, painting her skin in shades of gold and shadow as she leaned slightly into me, her fingers tracing idle patterns on my wrist while the silence between us deepened, no longer awkward but charged, filled with something unsaid and growing heavier by the second, and I could feel it in the air, in the warmth radiating off her body, in the way her breath seemed to match the rhythm of mine like she was unconsciously sinking to me again, just like in a hydro chamber, and I wasn't sure when the moment shifted from curious to intimate but it had, and now she was watching me closely, her violet eyes luminous in the dark. And when I met her gaze, she didn't look away, didn't speak, just tilted her head slightly and whispered, "Is this when humans choose to complete the bond?" And I swallowed hard, unsure how to answer because even though everything in me screamed caution, my body had already moved closer, my hand brushing against the small of her back where her skin felt impossibly smooth and warm, and she responded to that touch like I had flipped a switch buried deep inside her. Her breath catching as her lips parted and her fingers slid up my arm in slow, deliberate motion, like she was mapping me cell by cell, and when she spoke again her voice was quieter, almost reverent. "You feel right. Your body, your scent, your silence. I do not know how else to ask, so I will not ask. I will offer," and with that she leaned forward, brushing her cheek against mine in a gesture that felt more sacred than sexual, and then she kissed me again. Slower this time, deeper, with an aching softness that made my chest tighten because this wasn't about lust, not entirely, it was about need, about connection, about the terrifying vulnerability of two beings from opposite sides of the galaxy meeting in a place beyond culture and logic and choosing each other anyway. Her hand slid beneath my shirt with a kind of practiced delicacy, her fingers exploring the contours of my body like every inch meant something sacred, and I felt the tension in my spine melt beneath her touch. Not because she was seducing me, but because she wasn't trying to, she was simply being, simply giving, and that made it impossible to resist, and when I pulled her closer, her body molded into mine without hesitation, her skin glowing faintly where it met mine, the bioluminescence reacting to our shared heat and pulsing rhythms that danced across her back and shoulders, and I couldn't stop staring, couldn't stop touching, because everything about her felt designed to respond to closeness. Like her entire biology had evolved around contact and emotional reciprocity, and the more I gave her, the more she bloomed beneath me, her breath catching in small gasps, her hands tangled in my hair, her lips moving against my neck as though she was memorizing me one kiss at a time. I laid her down gently on the thermal blanket, the furs around her folding softly as she stretched out beneath me, her limbs graceful and open, her eyes watching me with a mix of trust and anticipation that nearly undid me. And when I hovered over her, unsure of what came next, she guided my hands to her sides and said, "No more thinking. Just feel. Just stay," and I did. I stayed. I kissed her again and again, each one slower, deeper, learning her through taste and touch, and when she arched into me, every glowing line on her body flaring bright like stars igniting across her skin, I understood then that this was the language of her people, this was their way of saying I am here, I am yours, I remember, and I never want to forget, and I matched her rhythm with my own, not rushing, not claiming, just answering, just listening, just being. There in the only way that mattered, skin to skin, breath to breath, heartbeat to heartbeat. The heat between us built slowly, like water warming over a low flame, and neither of us seemed in any hurry to reach whatever finish line our bodies might be chasing, because the journey itself was the point, The plan was simple, or at least as simple as anything could be in a cave on a frozen alien planet with a glowing girl wrapped in thermal furs who had just declared war on her former captors with nothing but a whisper and the fierce conviction of someone who had finally decided to stop running, and while we packed up what little gear we had left, checking the sled's battery reserve and double-bolting the entrance hatch with a modified compression lock, I kept glancing at her, watching the way she moved now. No longer with the cautious reverence of a bonded mate but with the quiet determination of someone preparing to face something ancient and inevitable, and I wanted to believe we had a chance, that the bond between us could somehow protect us from the reality of whatever force was descending on us, but even as I tightened the straps on my jacket and slung the energy blade across my back, I knew the odds were getting worse by the second, and I hadn't even begun to understand what we were truly up against until the air around us began to pulse again. Not with sound this time but with something deeper, a low harmonic frequency that made my skin crawl and my vision blur at the edges like the world itself was humming in disapproval, and she flinched, her hands flying to her ears as she dropped to one knee, whispering something in her language that made my stomach turn, and when I pulled her up, asking what was wrong, her answer chilled me in a way no physical weapon ever could. She said, "They are not here to take me. They are here to erase you." And at first I thought she meant metaphorically, that they were going to kill me to sever the bond or punish her, but when she looked up at me, her face pale and trembling, and added, "They found the resonance echo, they know your imprint is in me, and they have chosen to collapse it from the root," I realized with a sudden jolt of terror that this was not about eliminating a physical threat, it was about purging her mind, her memories, and every moment she had shared with me, and that was when the scanner beeped again and showed something impossible. Something I couldn't explain no matter how many times I recalibrated the data feed, because it wasn't a ship approaching, it wasn't a squad of enemies or a drone sweep or even a biological trace, it was me, a genetic and biometric match approaching from the west at a speed no human could survive without vaporizing, and I froze as the readout pulsed again, confirming the identity with 99.9% certainty, and I stared at the display like it had betrayed me, asking the one question that no one should ever have to ask out loud, "What do you mean I'm already here?" She looked at the scanner and her expression changed, not surprised but resigned, as though she had expected this moment, dreaded it, and her voice was low as she said, "They did not just clone your code, they replicated your presence, your resonance, and they are sending it here to overwrite you," and the words hit me like a physical blow because it wasn't just about identity now, it was about existential annihilation. About replacing me not by killing me but by erasing the version of me that mattered, the one who had bathed her, held her, kissed her, and letting a counterfeit take my place in the bond, and I asked her how that was even possible, how they could simulate a living person with such precision, and her answer was brutal in its simplicity, "Because you touched a null," and I stared at her in stunned silence, my pulse roaring in my ears as I whispered, "You never told me you were null-born," and she looked down, her voice shaking, "Because if I did, you would not have touched me, and if you had not touched me, I would be dead." I didn't know what to say because she was right. If she had told me the truth back then, that her species wasn't just alien but classified as an unstable genetic phenomenon capable of cross-resonance memory imprinting, I might have backed away, I might have reported her, but I didn't. I touched her, I cared for her, I loved her, and now the cave smelled like static and ozone after the memory core blast, the air still thick with residual energy and the faint whiff of burnt metal from the collapsed replica that had been wearing my face, and while my heart was still racing from the confrontation, from the fact that we had actually survived the impossible, the moment was almost immediately undercut by the sound of her stomach growling loudly in the stillness, which might have been dramatic timing or just cosmic cruelty, but either way it broke the tension like a hammer to glass, and she blinked, looking mildly startled by the sound her own body had made, and then turned to me with the most serious expression I had ever seen on anyone's face and said, "I require meat," as if she had just issued a royal decree, and I couldn't help it. I laughed, not because it was funny exactly, but because after everything we had just been through, that blunt demand felt like the universe reminding me that life did, in fact, go on, even when you had nearly been overridden by your own alien doppelganger and your girlfriend had just fried someone's synthetic nervous system with the power of remembered kisses and emotional bonding. And she tilted her head as I kept laughing, looking puzzled, and then slightly offended. "Is this another opposite pain?" And I wiped my eyes and managed to say between breaths, "No, that one was just real pain pretending to be sanity," which did nothing to clarify the situation for her, but she let it go and started rifling through our emergency pack with alarming determination. There was, tragically, no meat in the emergency pack, only 3 ration bars that claimed to be teriyaki flavor but had the texture of compressed bark and the scent of something that had been dead for decades, and when I offered her one, she took a cautious bite, chewed twice, then spat it into her hand and looked at it like it had betrayed her entire species. "Your food lies," she said simply, and I wanted to argue but she wasn't wrong. And for a moment we both just sat there in defeated silence, the only sounds the crackling of the heat lamp and the slow hiss of the scanner reinitializing, until she looked up and said, "You must hunt," and I froze mid-chew because while I had many useful skills, none of them included tracking wildlife in sub-zero weather with a mostly depleted energy blade and a digestive system that still thought instant noodles were an exotic delicacy. "You mean me, personally?" I asked, and she nodded, as if this were obvious. "You are the bonded mate. It is tradition," and that's how I found myself several minutes later trudging through knee-deep snow with a salvaged thermal cloak wrapped around my shoulders and a homemade spear made from a tent pole and a knife duct taped to the end, muttering under my breath about tradition and wondering what kind of cosmic joke I had signed up for. She stayed behind to fortify the cave, which mostly meant arranging the blankets into some kind of defensive nest and drawing strange symbols in the frost near the entrance using the tip of her claw, and I didn't question it because frankly I didn't have a better idea, so I followed the rover tracks out into the ridge and started scanning for life signs, hoping to find something small, slow, and preferably already dead, but instead I found a 4-legged creature with glowing red eyes and a horn the size of my arm that snorted steam every time I moved and seemed deeply unimpressed by my presence, and after a short but emotionally intense standoff, I slowly backed away, whispering apologies and prayers in equal measure, and returned to the cave with exactly one semi-frozen root vegetable I found half buried under the snow, which I presented to her with as much pride as I could fake, and she stared at it, then at me, and said, "You risked death for this," and I nodded solemnly. It was a very large vegetable, and she took it without another word, walked to the heat lamp, and began slicing it with one of her claws like it was the most valuable substance in the galaxy. We left the cave 2 days later beneath a pale sky streaked with silver clouds that shimmered faintly in the upper atmosphere, and as we walked across the uneven frost-covered ridge, her hand remained in mine, not because she needed help navigating the terrain but because she wanted to stay connected. And even though the wind bit at our faces and the cold seeped into every layer of our clothes, neither of us complained because we knew this part of the journey wasn't about comfort, it was about choosing a direction together, and the scanner on my wrist finally showed something I had long given up hoping for, a faint signal bounce off an old satellite in geostationary orbit that hadn't responded in months, and I spent an hour rerouting the transmission through a cracked terminal rigged with duct tape and hope until a weak confirmation tone flickered across the screen and a simple text response scrolled across the display, a message from Earth Station Delta confirming they had received our coordinates and were dispatching a long-range recovery craft, arrival estimate 16 hours, and for a long time we just stared at the blinking light like it was a dream we hadn't dared speak out loud, and then she looked at me with those brilliant violet eyes and said, "Does this mean I go with you now?" And I nodded, unsure if I could trust my voice not to crack because even after everything, a part of me had expected to lose her, to wake up one day and find her gone, as if she had only ever been a fragment of light clinging to the edge of a dream, but she was still here, warm and breathing and impossibly real, and the thought of bringing her home with me didn't just feel like hope, It felt like the first time I truly understood what it meant to believe in something bigger than survival. We spent those 16 hours tucked into the shelter of a half-buried comms pod that hadn't functioned in years, its walls lined with frost and old emergency blankets, and while I ran diagnostics and calibrated our beacon to increase signal clarity, she sat beside me carving patterns into the floor with a piece of broken metal, designs that shimmered faintly with her touch, like her memory was bleeding into the shape of the world around her. And I asked her what the symbols meant, and she said, "Names, not words," and when I looked closer, I realized some of them matched the pattern on her skin, the glowing lines that had pulsed when we touched and dimmed when she slept, and she traced them again slowly, deliberately. "This one is yours," she said, pointing to a swirl that looked like a star being pulled into orbit. "It means the moment I was not alone," and I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just wrapped my arm around her shoulder and held her close until the silence between us felt less like distance and more like gravity. The ship arrived in the dead of night, its thrusters lighting up the ridge like a second sunrise, and I felt her tense beside me as the hum of its engines echoed through the valley, and I knew she was afraid, not of the ship or the crew but of what came next, of what Earth might mean for someone like her, for someone who didn't have a place in any registry or species log or diplomatic protocol. And I took her hand again and promised her, quietly and fiercely, "You are not a guest, you are not a secret, you are not something to study or explain, you are coming home with me, and no one gets to unmake that." And she nodded, still quiet, still scared, but with a flicker of something behind her eyes that told me she believed me, that she was choosing to believe me, and that was more than enough. And when the hatch opened and the rescue officer stepped out in his polished suit and expressionless visor, I raised my hand slowly and said, "Two survivors, one human, one non-human, both with memory resonance signatures confirmed," and I half expected resistance, some bureaucratic demand for scans or containment or quarantine, but the officer looked at us for a long moment, then stepped aside and said simply, "Welcome aboard."